The emergence of dynamic psychiatry as we know it today can be traced back to 1775, to a clash between the physician Franz Mesmer and the exorcist Johann Gassner. It was a clash between tradition and enlightenment. Gassner's age-old techniques of exorcism was ultimately overthrown by Mesmer's new ideas and techniques. However, Mesmer's organization was short-lived and his ideas ended up being rejected as well. But his work laid the groundwork for the emergence of dynamic psychiatry almost a century later. In 1775, crowds of people were rushing to the small German town of Ellwangen to see Gassner perform exorcisms on people. Patients were brought to him that suffered from convulsive fits. Gassner would command the evil spirit that he believed to be the cause of the illness to manifest. They would immediately start to convulse and exhibit symptoms. Gassner could actually direct the spirit to cause convulsions in certain areas of the body, and he could command the spirit to manifest different symptoms such as anger, silliness, grief, and even the appearance of death. Having mastered the spirit, it was as simple as casting it out, which he did to much success. Gassner believed that there were two types of illness, the first being natural ones belonging to the realm of physicians, and the second being preternatural ones, which he divided into three categories. Circumcessio, which imitated natural illness but was caused by the devil, obsessio, which was caused by sorcery, and possessio, which is classical diabolic possession. Although Gassner was one of the most famous healers of his time, there was much controversy surrounding his methods. Europe was in the middle of the Enlightenment at the time, and the church's influence had greatly diminished in the wake of the scientific revolution. In that same year, 1775, Dr. Franz Mesmer arrived in Munich and claimed to have discovered a new principle called animal magnetism. He was able to demonstrate these techniques and was able to cause symptoms and remove symptoms by simply touching a patient. This technique was very similar to the powers Gassner was displaying. As a matter of fact, Mesmer claimed that Gassner was unknowingly using animal magnetism during his exorcisms. This explanation was accepted by the political leaders of the time and caused the church to heavily regulate any practice of exorcism, which led to its decline, thus setting the stage for the birth of dynamic psychiatry. Early on in Mesmer's medical career, he was treating a patient who was afflicted with 15 severe symptoms. He studied the astronomical periods in which her symptoms would occur and eventually could predict, by the stars and planets, when she would have another attack. At this time, some physicians in Europe had just started treating certain diseases with magnets, which gave Mesmer the idea of using magnets to negate the pull the astronomical arrangements were having on her body, which he believed were causing the symptoms. He prepared a solution containing iron and had her swallow it. He then attached specially made magnets to her stomach and legs. The patient soon began to feel mysterious streams of fluid running downwards through her body, relieving her of all her symptoms for several hours. Mesmer realized that this cure couldn't have been caused by the magnets alone, which led him to develop a theory that the fluid the patient felt was the real source of the cure, and that fluid had come from him, and the magnets were just a way of reinforcing and directing this fluid, which he called animal magnetism. As a result of his treatment, his patient improved, so much that she was able to live a normal life. This seemingly magical cure won Mesmer much fame. However, most of the other medical professionals strongly disapproved of his methods and considered him a quack. In spite of this disapproval, his results were undeniable. He was observed by learned professionals exhibiting influence over the people magnetized. People reported becoming very sleepy when he would play music. He could make people lose their voice by touching them and give it back to them with a flick of a finger. He could influence people in another room by simply pointing at their reflections in a mirror. In one instance, a musician was playing an instrument, and Mesmer placed his hand on the instrument. Immediately, everyone within earshot exhibited symptoms until he removed his hand. Mesmer traveled around and cured many people, including restoring hearing to the deaf and sight to the blind. However, that blind patient only claimed to be able to see when near Mesmer and lost vision when not around him. In 1778, Mesmer arrived in Paris. Paris was much more open to his theories than Vienna, where the medical fraternity had largely rejected them. While practicing in Paris, he expanded his system, which can be summed up with 4 major points. The first being, a subtle physical fluid fills the universe and connects man, Earth, and the heavenly planets and stars, and also connects man to other men. The second principle is, disease is caused by an unequal distribution of this fluid in the body. Therefore, the cure is to redistribute the fluid and create an equilibrium. The third principle is, with certain techniques, this fluid can be channeled, stored, and conveyed to other people. And the final principle is that using these techniques, one can cause symptoms or cure them. Mesmer believed that all people possess some degree of the animal magnetism, but some possess more than others. Mesmer denied that there was anything mystical about this technique and attempted to explain it rationally. However, psychology was still unknown back then, so rather than attributing these phenomena to psychological causes, he worked with what he had, which was Isaac Newton's physics, and tried to make his theory fit into what he knew about the universe. He believed this fluid worked in similar principles as electricity. Mesmer claimed to have discovered a cure for all illness. With his success, he gained many disciples and established a magnetism institution in France. Over time, his relationship with his disciples became strained, and he reached his peak of success in 1784, which was followed by a rapid downfall. Mesmer had agitated a lot of other physicians, and as a result, the King of France appointed a commission of members of the Academy of Medicine and Science, which included the American ambassador Benjamin Franklin, to investigate Mesmer's claims. They concluded that there was no proof of his magnetic fluid theory, and his cures were the result of imagination, what we would call the placebo effect today. Slowly but surely, Mesmer lost all of his credibility and left Paris and lived out the rest of his life in obscurity. Although that was the end of Mesmer, it was not the end of the magnetism movement. However, it was taken in a new direction by one of his most faithful disciples, the Marquis de Puysegur. Puysegur had discovered in his course of treating patients that while magnetized, they were surprisingly lucid and could answer questions, which later, in their normal state, they would have no memory of. He found that the patient could not only diagnose themselves in this magnetized state, but they could predict the course the disease would take and prescribe their own treatment as well. Puysegur acquired so many patients that he had to figure out how to treat them in groups. He did this by magnetizing a tree that had ropes attached to it. The patients would sit by the tree and tie the other end of the rope around the afflicted parts of their bodies. It is said after a month of this treatment, 62 out of the 300 patients were cured. This waking state of magnetic lucidity resembled somnambulism, or sleepwalking, in many ways, and became known as artificial somnambulism, and would one day become known as hypnotism. Puysegur's movement continued to grow until it was interrupted by the French Revolution in 1789. Puysegur's name eventually faded into obscurity, and his writings became scarce. It wasn't until 1884, during the height of hypnotism's popularity, that his writings were rediscovered. The ideas contained in magnetism lived on into the early 1800s, and men like Pierre Janet attributed them with discovering what had become hypnotism. However, the movement was mostly practiced by laymen, and it never managed to gain scientific recognition. The next major development in the emergence of dynamic psychiatry came in 1826 with the poet-physician Justinus Kerner. Kerner was treated by a magnetizer when he was a child. Later in his life, he treated a patient that was close to death. He tried every conventional medical approach, but she just got worse and worse. He finally resorted to magnetism, and she started to improve. During her states of magnetic sleep, she was more lucid than anyone he had previously treated. Talking with her in this state revealed her remarkable capacity to predict events like a seeress. Kerner conducted a thorough investigation of this phenomenon. Many people who visited the seeress were very impressed with what she had to say, and none of them thought she was a fraud. She accurately predicted future events, and there were even reports of objects mysteriously moving around her. She often spoke in an unknown language, which she claimed was the forgotten original language of mankind. She translated this language, and some even learned to speak it. In her trances, she often prescribed herself medications which unfailingly cured her as predicted. Many philosophers and theologians became interested in the case and made a great study of it. Despite this renewed interest in the case, which bordered on parapsychology, the magnetism movement rapidly declined after 1850, where it was gradually absorbed by occultism and replaced by the Spiritism movement. The Spiritism movement started between the years of 1840 and 1850 in America, and by 1852 had spread to England and Germany. By the following year, it had spread all across Europe. This movement led to the rise of the spiritual medium, who would conduct seances to communicate with the world of the spirit. In the 1860s, the movement reached its peak. There were even reports of mediums causing spirits to physically manifest, and pictures were reportedly taken. The Spiritism movement gradually receded, but it remained popular in Paris. A scientific study on the Spiritism system was taken up, and a new science of parapsychology gradually emerged. Spiritism influenced the early psychologists in many ways. It provided them with new approaches to the mind. The technique of automatic writing, where the medium would write out messages from the spirits in a trance-like state, was later used by psychologists to explore the unconscious mind. Around this time, the first professional hypnotists started to appear. Although at first, hypnotism wasn't widely accepted, as the movement grew, many neurologists started to reconsider their opinions on hypnotism, and it became widely accepted by the 1880s. University physicians began to study hypnotism, and two major schools rose up to teach it, the Nancy School and the Salpêtrière School. One of the first people to practice hypnotism openly was Auguste Liébault, who went on to start the Nancy School. Liébault garnered many patients and had much success in curing them with hypnotism. For much of his life, his colleagues wrote him off as a quack. However, in 1882, the renowned neurologist Hippolyte Bernheim went to visit Liébault after hearing about his miracle cure. Bernheim was won over by what he saw, thus giving hypnotism some credibility. Bernheim became Liébault's pupil, and although Liébault was considered the founder of the Nancy School, Bernheim became its leader, practically speaking. As hypnotism spread across the rest of Europe, Bernheim became known as one of the foremost experts on psychotherapy, and many physicians visited the Nancy School to learn from him, including a 2-week visit by Sigmund Freud in 1889, who was then early in his career and relatively unknown. The Nancy School was small and relatively unorganized, whereas the Salpêtrière School was very well organized and led by a powerful figure and a great teacher, the neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot was considered the greatest neurologist of his time. When Charcot was a medical intern at the Salpêtrière Hospital, he realized he housed many patients with rare neurological disease that would be great for clinical research. Later in his career, when he was appointed as a chief physician, he carried out his plans and began his research. He started off by studying hysteria, and by 1878 had extended his research into the realm of hypnotism. After scientifically analyzing and experimenting with hypnotism, Charcot's reports on the technique finally won hypnotism recognition amongst the medical community, after it had already been rejected 3 times under the name of magnetism. Charcot was able to demonstrate that post-traumatic paralysis was a result of a hypnotic-like state the patient experienced after the traumatizing event. He was able to use hypnotic suggestion to induce paralysis of limbs and also to undo the paralysis in neurotic patients. Charcot gained international fame, and many physicians came to study at the Salpêtrière. Charcot famously would conduct popular lectures where he would demonstrate his techniques with an actual hysterical patient for his students. Many people were impressed with these demonstrations, including Sigmund Freud, who spent 4 months studying at the Salpêtrière in 1885 and 1886. All this is not to say that Charcot's rise to fame didn't create many enemies for him. Some physicians, such as Joseph Delboeuf, had extremely strong doubts about the techniques he witnessed at the Salpêtrière, believing the experiments were carried out too sloppily to be considered legitimate. The clergy considered him an atheist, and many atheists considered him too spiritual. Perhaps the most objective critique of Charcot's methods came from one of the founding fathers of psychology, Pierre Janet. Janet points out that Charcot mistakenly tried to make generalizations about all mental diseases, but only chose subjects who displayed the most symptoms, and just assumed that the same principles applied towards all mental disease. In an attempt to simplify his case studies for the sake of his students, Charcot oversimplified many of the complex symptoms he was treating. And perhaps the most important critique, due to the educational nature of Charcot's experiments, many of the patients learned, along with the students, what kind of reaction the hypnotic procedures were supposed to bring about. Due to the heightened sense of suggestibility the hypnotic state induces, there is no way to tell if these reactions were due to natural observation or if they were the result of an unintentional suggestion by inexperienced hypnotists. We have now set the stage for the first great pioneers of dynamic psychiatry, men like Janet and Freud. However, without the work of Mesmer, Pusiger, the Spiritists of the 19th century, and the work carried out by the Nancy and Salpêtrière schools, these pioneers would not have inherited the body of knowledge that was essential for the expansion and systemization of their revolutionary schools of thought.